The only people who knew about this backtrack were President Clinton, Secretary Madeleine Albright, Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat. All the other people in the delegations were not aware of this creativity exercise. It did not help to getting any closer to an agreement, but it did help to understand the other in terms of concerns, not the positions.
That's Gilead Sher, describing the use of back-channel discussions and how they can be an effective way for the parties to move past positions and gain a greater understanding of each other's interests. Gilead is an Israeli attorney who specializes in international negotiations, both business and political. He served as Chief of Staff and Policy Coordinator to Israel's former Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, Ehud Barak. In that capacity, he acted as one of Israel's senior peace negotiators at the Camp David Summit in 2000 and the Taba talks in 2001, as well as in extensive rounds of covert negotiations with the Palestinians. Gilead has lectured on negotiation, mediation, and dispute resolution at several institutions, including the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, Tel Aviv University, and Harvard's program in negotiation, and he is currently a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Gilead is a reserve colonel in the Israel Defense Forces and author of several articles and books, including his latest, Reflections on Conflict Resolution in the Middle East and Beyond, published by World Scientific Publishing. I'm your host, Warren Hoffman, and in this episode of Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, Gilead covers a range of topics and taps into his wealth of experience at the negotiation table, sharing first-hand stories of the Israel-Palestine negotiations while extracting useful takeaways for negotiators. Some topics discussed include constructive unilateralism, how to make peace without a negotiation partner, social media as a tool for peace building, how Iran went from a weak hand to strike a good deal at the 2015 nuclear negotiations, Jimmy Carter's drafting of a single negotiated text at the 1978 Camp David negotiations between Israel and Egypt, the use of hardball tactics, negotiation process design, impasses, and why Bill Clinton lost his cool during the Camp David negotiations, and much more.
This is Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, podcast of the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation.
Hi Gilead, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Warren.
Can you give us a brief overview of your background and what you do?
I'm a practicing attorney. I'm also a reserve colonel in the Israel Defense Forces. And I served several times throughout the negotiation process between Israel and its neighbors. I served in government several times. The first time was under Prime Minister Rabin at the outset of the negotiations on the interim agreement with the Palestinians, the Oslo B agreement, as it is called, throughout 1994, 1995. I was responsible for the coordination and part of the lead commissions in the security and the legal realm. And later on, I was chief and co-chief negotiator on permanent status throughout Camp David and Taba and the talks that we held in the late 90s, the early 2000s. I am also a researcher and a scholar in this domain. I taught negotiations both in Harvard and Georgetown as a visiting professor, as a researcher at the INSS, the Israel National Security Studies Institute. And I'm currently a Baker Institute at Rice University, a Baker Institute fellow at Rice University in Houston, Texas, dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian and the Israeli-Arab conflict and conflict resolution.
The term intractable conflict, it's used differently by some to mean impossible to solve, while others have sort of a softer version that it's agreement is possible, but it's highly complex, deeply rooted, identity-based, protracted. Assuming that it is that the Israeli-Palestine conflict is the latter, what have you come to understand about intractable conflicts?
Well, the main lesson or the bottom line of my learning about that is that all conflicts are eventually resolved. and that even intractable and protracted conflicts of dozens and even hundreds of years do get to an end eventually. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a complex, a complicated, multidimensional one, as you rightly stated. But our conflict can be resolved and should be resolved. But we need to be proactive doing so, which has not been the case, regrettably, for enough time and enough rounds of negotiations. As a matter of fact, for the last 8 years, since 2014, Israeli and Palestinian leadership have not negotiated final status issues, and the intermittent conflict is hardening, and the attitudes, the narratives are getting more extreme. There's no shared political horizon that exists between the parties, and there's a growing sense that the paradigm of a two-state for two people solution is lost. I mentioned the interim agreement a couple of minutes ago. It was supposed to last for just 5 years and be replaced by a permanent status agreement, but we are at its 27th year and there's no permanent status agreement. Now, Israel seriously endeavored to resolve this 100-year dispute and the occupation of half a century of the West Bank through negotiating permanent status, but only twice since the Oslo Accords. In the late 90s, under Prime Minister Barak, in Camp David, in Taba, and in between, and in 2007, 2008, under Prime Minister Olmert. Now, if you look at the last 3 decades, since the Madrid conference in the early 90s, after the first Gulf War, 3 decades, and only about 10% of the time was dedicated to negotiations on a full-fledged, comprehensive agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. And I believe that the resolution of this conflict is indispensable to both Palestinians and Israelis because the status quo offers no security, no hope, and it is inconsistent with the Zionist vision of a democratic nation state to the Jewish people. And it is inconsistent with the Palestinian aspiration to have a self-determination in a country of their own with sovereignty, statehood, etc. I believe that it is still attainable throughout a constructive approach, a series of transitional and interim phases, and some independent steps taken by both parties, but all consistent with continuous negotiation, binding negotiations, with the vision of a two-state for two people in mind.
Just to spend a bit more time on this, is it largely a distributive negotiation? You wrote that during the 2000 Camp David summit that President Bill Clinton urged Yasser Arafat to negotiate Jerusalem, but that he blew up the summit because he's unwilling to compromise on Jerusalem. So is this largely a distributive issue that ultimately requires the two-state solution to subdivide the region, or are there opportunities for more of a integrative negotiation to sort of create value?
Well, yes and no, because yes, we do have to opt for a partition of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea into two nation states, one Israeli, one Palestinian, that would have a border between them and might cooperate afterwards, kind of a structure of confederation, perhaps, or anything more cooperative. But first, you have to distinguish between two distinct national entities in order to have one state that is the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, the only one, the single one worldwide, and the other one, the only nation state of the Palestinian people. Now, between the river and the sea, we have 14 million people, 14 million people, Israelis, Palestinians, Muslims, Jews, Christians, and others. That's not a lot of people. But if you have a one-state reality, then it is a constant, perpetrated civil conflict between the two populations because they are almost equal in numbers in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and within Israel, the Israeli Arabs, vis-a-vis the Israeli Jews. So you cannot contain such large minorities within a democratic nation state. This is why the two-state for two people provides stability, sustainability, and sovereignty.
Yeah, so some sequencing there in terms of the opportunities for collaboration, but the necessity of the two-state solution first, and the benefits of doing so. Thanks for your take on that and your take on this conflict, 100-year conflict, as you mentioned. Perhaps we'll get back to it, but I do want to shift gears for now to talk about your new book, Reflections on Conflict Resolution in the Middle East and Beyond. Can you give us an overview of the book?
Yes, well, thank you for mentioning that. The book comprises of 15 chapters and articles that I've published in the last decade or so, decade and a half. It has 5 main parts. The first one is conflict resolution and social activism, referring to social media and peace building and the new role of the public in climate politics and even negotiating anti-Semitism in Europe. The second part concentrates on Israeli-Palestinian outlooks, the partition plan that I've mentioned, the ramification of termination of the Oslo Accords, the EU role, not just the US role in the Middle East, and more particularly in the Israeli-Palestinian resolution of the conflict, and what could be a framework agreement on permanent status between Israelis and Palestinians. That's the second part. The third part is an Arab-Israeli perspective relating to the Arab Peace Initiative, to the Abraham Accords of 2020, signed between Israel, Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, and the UAE, and the security challenges that affect policy making and peace building in the Middle East. Then I move to the fourth part, which is the context of US, Iran, Israel negotiations, the JCPOA, and the road towards it back in 2015. And I give a kind of a guide for the perplexed in terms of that. And the last part is conflict resolution, relates to conflict resolution in the absence of negotiations. How can you resolve conflicts when there's no negotiations? So how do you make peace with no partners? How do you make peace despite the fact that negotiations do not bear fruits? And once again, I talk about constructive unilateralism or independent steps taken by the parties that do not negate the final outcome of the negotiations.
Quite a piece of work. Can we zoom in on a couple of those? The social media piece is interesting for sure. It's a hot one. Perhaps we could start there. I'd also like to talk about the Iran and then the conflict resolution in the absence of negotiations as well, in particular. So let's start with the social media piece. Can you speak a bit more about that one?
Sure. We can reach out to billions of persons over the globe by just hitting our smartphone. Peace building is something that could be quite prominent if you use these networks wisely to accommodate mindsets, to compromises, to reconciliation, to peace. And I'm not talking only about the young generation. I'm talking about the young generation as a sector that incentivizes changes throughout social networks, such as what happened in the climate change negotiations and the climate change politics with just one young lady of 16 that got what she wanted by using wisely in a kind of a determined fashion what she wanted to achieve.
Do you have any other examples other than Greta of anyone else who's been harnessing the power of social media for peace work?
I do provide some examples, such as the Kenyan case. We don't have enough time to dig deeply on that, but
who is it orchestrated by? Just quickly, is there one body that sets out with the objective to implement sort of a social media campaign in hopes of achieving peace, or is it just sort of?
There was a myriad actors here. But what we've learned is that it is a very powerful way to achieve what you want to achieve, which is peace building and an eventual reconciliation between conflicting parties. And it succeeded there. And our conclusion in this chapter, in this article, is that this is a tool that needs to be developed proactively in order to succeed. And you cannot neglect the way it affects public opinion and people's mindsets, collective and individual.
Powerful tool, and is being applied in so many ways already, like for marketing and increasing profits, probably for security in many ways we're not aware of, but yes, to be applied for something positive like helping to create peace in a purposeful way should definitely be explored. In the book, you also analyzed the negotiations that led to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Anything in particular stand out for you from taking a deep look at those talks?
So, to us, and especially to someone who was part of the research, a journalist, an investigative journalist by the name of Jay Solomon, the puzzle was how Iran went from a weak negotiating position to attainment of such a good deal from its own perspective. And we've identified 5 main reasons for that. The first one was Obama's own fear of Israeli attack pushed him to engage more intensively diplomatically. Second one is the shift in the DNA of the key personnel from the first Obama administration to the second, with John Kerry significantly less hawkish on Iran than Clinton was in the first term. Then Kerry's domination of the negotiations, which was not planned initially to happen, was not planned in advance. And finally, Obama's sense that the negotiation was a key to his own legacy as a president, which meant, in other words, that in Tehran, they could hear the ticking clock. And one level below that, you need to take into consideration that Iran and Russia were working together behind the scenes of negotiations, which was a main factor for what happened there. So these are the lessons, and I hope that they were well taken by the current administration.
Yeah. A lot of those seem to be external factors that allowed them to go from that weak position. Like the Obama's regime and the change in the negotiation team, and Obama wanting, seeing it as his legacy and whatnot. So perhaps a bit of luck there in Iran's favor. The external factors which are influencing a negotiation can be so important. Thanks for sharing those 5 factors. Let's shift to the chapter on making peace with no partners, if you would. Can you talk more about the idea of constructive unilateralism?
When you have a clear process management of negotiations, and at a certain point in time, this process ceases to exist, and there's no management of any kind of dialogue between the parties, then what is it that replaces it except for a vacuum? And here, if you as a party, if you have your own strategic targets, your own objectives, you know where you want to go, you have a very clear reading of your own interests, you know where you would have liked the negotiations to end from your perspective, then you have to adapt to this change in the conditions and the circumstances, reframe your positions, offer a fresh thinking to both yourself and the other party, even without talking to one another, and try to attain the objectives throughout constructive unilateral steps that you take and that the other party takes, and encourage even the other party to take these constructive steps. that are in line with what you were negotiating before. I'll give you an example, okay, in the Israeli-Palestinian context, despite the fact that we've just touched it very superficially. For instance, what could be the most, I would say, pressing interest of Israel? The most pressing interest of Israel is security. And for that, it has to delineate a border, let's say, more or less in line with the security fence in the West Bank. Israel can, if it wishes to do so, draw a provisional border unilaterally around this line of the security fence and tell the Palestinians, look, the door is open to negotiations. But if you don't move, we are going to make Israel the democratic nation state of the Jewish people. We are going to take some partition steps unilaterally without your consent. Happy to negotiate with you, but if there's no negotiations, we'll do it for our own sake in order not to allow you to have a veto on our future. What could the Palestinians do unilaterally? They could stop or at least subside violence, terrorism. They don't need us for that. They could do it by their own. They could stop the international, legal, and diplomatic warfare campaign that they have against Israel unilaterally. They don't need us for that. And by doing that, you create a reality that, on the one hand, preserves the condition for resuming negotiations at any future time, but also a reality that on the ground is a two-state solution without a full-fledged agreement or without agreement whatsoever. Even when you don't have a partner, you can communicate with the non-partner that you have. Even when you don't have a partner, you can have a momentum on the ground. Even if you don't have a partner, there's no reason you stop to be creative and find a larger pie to distribute or to divide between the parties. But it requires a lot of leadership. It requires a lot of courage, because unilateralism is not, it's not a dirty word, but it's not very popular. Of course, a negotiated agreement is the ultimate goal. But your question refers to a situation in which you cannot reach this goal. I've seen conflicts that were eventually resolved that for large periods of time, there was no negotiation whatsoever. It was like that in Northern Ireland, in South Africa. There were months and months that F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela did not talk to one another. But still they found ways to communicate throughout envoys, below radar screen, and exchange some ideas and some non-official coordinated steps throughout this period. This is what I refer to as.
Yeah. That's an interesting topic, and something that could be done at any level of negotiations. I assume the big consideration here would be what exactly constitutes a constructive move, something that's a constructive unilateral move, opposed to not being constructive. Yet you also mentioned encouraging the other to make their own unilateral moves. How would one go about that? It's kind of a tricky situation.
Well, this also refers to a psychological and even social dimension of the negotiations, because what you do in negotiations is you try to build something together. And here you don't have this togetherness. But still you have to imagine that you would help the other party to market the outcome of this step that he would take, and that you would be helped by the other party to market in your own constituency, the steps that you have taken, even though it is unilateral steps. And it relates to the personalities that are involved, to the persuading the other that by doing whatever you would like them to do, they are improving their options. They create a larger pie along with you. And there's kind of a rolling reassessment all the time when you negotiate and when you don't negotiate. How far am I from doing what needs to be done in order to achieve my goals? And how far is the other party from achieving his own goals without me poking a finger in their eyes and vice versa. So here, there's a big question in negotiations. How much do the behavior and the comportment of leaders and principals affect the outcome of negotiations? It's a big question mark here because there's no clear answer to that. Sometimes a broker, a third party, is much more effective and efficient in providing the way out of no negotiations because they do the back and forth between one party and the other and close the gap between the parties. Back in 1978, when the negotiations between Israel and Egypt took part, only 5 years after a very bloody war of 3 weeks, the 1973 war, Yom Kippur War, between Israel, Syria, and Egypt, President Jimmy Carter summoned Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, and Menachem Begin, prime minister of Israel, to Camp David for negotiations on an Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. And it turned out that Carter was kind of a broker, a double broker for both the Israeli interests and the Egyptian interests. He did this with, I think, about more than a dozen drafts in his own handwriting from the one to the other, because there was a certain point in time where Sadat and Begin, despite the two being great historical leaders, they could not stand one another in the same room. So Carter filled the gap here and filled the vacuum between them. And he got the commitments and the certainty of the crystallization of such an agreement throughout his leadership within Camp David. And he got them to the most important part of any agreement, which is the closing of the agreement.
That's great. The 12 or so handwritten drafts. That's wonderful.
I think that even more, I saw them all when we were in Camp David much later, more than 15 years later, in 2000. We saw them hung on the walls of one of the cabins. So this was a testimony of true brokerage by a leader to a very important agreement that is still in force after more than 40 years.
Yeah. The single negotiated text in action. And for shuttle diplomacy, I'm sure there are a whole different set of skills required than being at the table, as well as a lot of trust needed in that third party as well.
Sometimes it happens even when there is a negotiation in the room. So you need to use a third party in order to provide the degree of flexibility that you might need, that you cannot officially put on the table. So you get the third party to pocket your commitment and use kind of a mediation skills in order to get the other party's commitments and merge them in a way.
So we're talking about the mediator providing opportunities to save face, essentially here. Is that right? Or
yeah, not necessarily saving face, but extending messages that are more accurate than the ones that are conveyed from one party to another within the room or around the table. They're more precise, and they have a degree of flexibility that does not exist in the official negotiation. I always believe that even in the absence of a broker or a third party that acts as a mediator, there's always a huge advantage to having a backtrack, a track two, that is much more secluded, below radar screen, that allows the two parties to advance together, hand in hand, towards the area in which an agreement is possible. And then you can interject their output into the official table.
So that's a whole nother track, or is that could that be achieved through caucusing as well? Like any thoughts on
You
differences
can
there?
use both. This is not, none of this is mutually exclusive. I mean, you can use both simultaneously. Even in Camp David 2000, in July 2000, we had a backtrack that was very, very creative and very, I think, showed more flexibility in terms of both parties. We had Mohammed Dahlan and Saib Arikat on the Palestinian side, and we had Shlomo Ben-Ami and myself on the Israeli side. The only people who knew about this backtrack were President Clinton, Secretary Madeleine Albright, Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat. All the other people in the delegations were not aware of this creativity exercise until it was disclosed to them when we finished the exercise. It did not help to getting any closer to an agreement, but it did help to understand the other in terms of concerns, not the positions, the real fears, and really the degree of openness that you get in this kind of exercises is sometimes terrific. Just a minute, I have a cat here. Okay. And sometimes, what you can do in order to advance, you just switch roles. You play the other and you present their own standpoints, interests, concerns, etc. And they do the same to you. This opens up a lot more flexibility once you understand and you try to persuade with the other party's argument. It's an interesting ball game, negotiations, Fascinating, actually.
Yeah. No, that is
the way you communicate with the other, the way you include people and constituencies and sectors that are completely against what you're doing, just to get them on board without any problems at the end. The way you get commitments from the other parties along the way, the timing of identifying the opportunities. And I think that one lesson that I've learned is that if you identify correctly the problems and you depersonalize them, you get much farther in setting your goals correctly and attaining them.
There's so many directions we could go here. You mentioned a ball game. Any examples or what's your examples or insights, thoughts on hardball tactics? What have you seen? Do you find them useful? Is there a place for them? Are they just an obstacle? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it all depends on how trustworthy you are in the eyes of the counterpart. If they know that what you reflect as the realistic red lines or non-negotiable issues, if you do reflect correctly and accurately, then hardball is considered positive. But if you just play a hardball game, they call your bluff immediately. And I can do that with any counterpart based on just knowing their place in the hierarchy and how close they are to the decision maker. Okay. Hardball tactics could be played by others outside the negotiation room: terrorism, violence, all kinds of manifestations of mistrust to your own leadership or to the other party, for instance. Whom are you dealing with? They would tell you. Okay, and by what kind of authority? And you hear these noises when you're inside. You're not detached from the reality outside the room. So these factors do affect the attitude and the atmosphere of the negotiation room. And in that respect, you might not be the one that wants to play hardball tactics, but there's someone else from your side or from the other side or from the other sides that does that. It's not very common to get any gains out of just playing hard, but you get a lot of points in negotiations by being very firm on what is the essential, fundamental interest of yours and representing it correctly.
Yeah. There's a difference between firmness and sticking to your principles than a hardball tactic. And your approach then, when you do feel someone's using a hardball tactic, is to call the tactic immediately. Is that
sure?
That's
sure,
your
timing is everything in negotiations. Circumstances might change. Politics might change outside the negotiation room, throughout the negotiation process. It depends on what you're negotiating about, and you have to switch to a completely different set of goals that is completely different from the one that you started with. And there's a lot of importance to the media, to the public opinion, to the consensus building, and to the carving out of a public opinion that would be supportive of the negotiation outcome, including the sectors and the communities that might be negatively affected from the negotiation results, such as, for instance, in our case, the Israeli-Palestinian case, the settlers could be very negatively affected by the outcome of the negotiations. So might be the Palestinian refugees. So there's, it's multidimensional, and you have to keep that in mind, but you have to be very organized in terms of the process, the management of the process, of a binding mechanism of negotiations, and not just, hands on and hands off, and a kind of a intermittent negotiation process. This is very problematic. I'm a great believer in process management, in processes in general, because then you find out what are the mandates and the coalitions that you can create, what the ways can you communicate with whoever is outside of or away from the negotiation table. Whom do you need to include in your planning, in your thoughts, and in your moving forward? And of course, as I said, timing, sequencing, signing, and the leadership are also factors that you have to take into account. The leadership or the lack of leadership in certain cases. That's a lot to carry into the negotiation room. And, one of the phases that is the most challenging is not necessarily negotiation with the other party. It's going back to your principles, to your leadership, and persuade them that what you did in the negotiation room is the very best for them. Okay, and that even if you went beyond the mandate that you were initially given, that this serves the interest of your state, your government, your community. So that's another phase that we tend to forget. But when you go back home, this is the challenge that you have.
Can you talk a bit about impasses? I'm curious about the dynamics. Do you have a sense that you're reaching them? How do you feel the psychology sort of changes as there's an impending impasse? And perhaps when you notice that, do you do anything to try to get around them? Or do you have anything at all on impasses?
There's so many. So many impasses throughout negotiations. When you negotiate a multidimensional, complex conflict, and you would like to attain at least a partial resolution of the conflict, then anything could serve as a sticking point. I'll give you a couple of examples. In preparation for Camp David summit in July 2000. The two parties agreed to hold a series of top secret negotiations in order to prepare the summit for the leaders, and have then President Clinton crack heads with Arafat and Barak on issues that they historically, personally, politically are the only ones that could agree or disagree on. So we prepared a series of meetings, very secret, in Sweden, in full secrecy. We flew out in the middle of the night in a private plane, a couple of negotiators from the Palestinian side, Abu Allah and Hassan Asfour, from the Israeli side, Shlomo Ben Ami and myself. And as we land in Sweden and we ride to the place where the negotiations should have taken place, there is an Israeli newsreel about Israelis and Palestinians negotiating permanent status in a northern European country. So Abu Allah, the chief negotiator of the Palestinian side, he says, I cannot negotiate. He goes out of the room. I'm risking my life here. And we could not even talk to him throughout half of the first day of negotiations. Then what we did, in order to diffuse this atmosphere, we took him out to a trip on foot along a lake, a little lake that was there. We started telling jokes, etc., and little by little he opened up. And we resumed negotiations in the afternoon. It went very, very well. We had a non-paper that was drafted in this round, covering all the core issues with a series of divergences, a series of convergences, and a series of bridging formula for the summit. But in the summit, at a certain point in time, President Clinton entered the room in which we negotiated the territory, settlements, the core issues, let me remind you, are Jerusalem and the holy sites, the territory, settlements, boundaries, security arrangements, and the Palestinian refugees. These are the four core issues that were tabled in Oslo until permanent status negotiations began. So, discussing territories, President Clinton comes in. He was not supposed to be in the room, and he asked the two negotiators, the Israeli and the Palestinian, at what stage are you? What are you negotiating? And when Abu Allah, as the head of the negotiation delegation there, presented his case, President Clinton was furious. He said, "You are not at the UN right now. You are not at the General Assembly." And then, Abu Allah was very upset. He did not talk for the rest of the day. This was an impasse. We had to restart from scratch the negotiations on territory 2 days afterwards. And then there was another sticking point, which was Jerusalem, and that was what blew up the summit in 2000.
Can you help me understand Clinton's approach there?
We are all human. So it happens. When nothing is happening, the leaders are not advancing, or at least Arafat was not advancing towards at least accepting some basic guidelines for the negotiations. He wanted 100% of his aspirations to be accepted by the parties. He was very suspicious of Barak's intentions, of Clinton's intentions, of Clinton's environment, attitude. Most of them were American Jews, so he was very suspicious. Ross and Aaron Miller and Madeleine Albright, Sandy Berger. So he was furious because he was not reciprocated in his efforts to bring peace, permanent peace to the Middle East. And I believe that this was, at a certain point in time, it kind of blows up. This would happen. I think that he apologized afterwards.
Okay.
And it went well afterwards. But nevertheless, this was a kind of an impasse that could have been avoided.
Okay, sensitive to your time here, I just want to switch gears real quickly here. I know you have a karate martial arts background, and quite high ranking at that. Just thinking about negotiators in general, do you have any analogies or parallels of karate skills that you think have made you a better negotiator? Didn't see that one coming, did you?
I know, I did not, as a matter of fact. But I can tell you this, always eliminate your ego when you are facing another human being. Listen, try to understand what's happening on the other side of the table, in the other person's internal thinking, and try to be at least, when he moves, let's say that you are facing one another, as we are not opponents, okay? We are counterparts in negotiations, but it's almost the same. When he doesn't move, I don't move. But when he moves, I've already moved. Okay, you got it?
I have an idea, but please go a little further with that. I like it.
Okay, I'm trying not to get surprised. I told you I'm a practicing attorney. When I have litigation in court, I don't want to be surprised. I want to surprise the others. When I cross-examine, I don't want to get any answer that I was not prepared. I don't want to ask a question I will regret. Same here. You have to prepare very thoroughly and reassess the situation all the time, kind of perpetual reassessment. Because if you are well prepared and you know all the issues and you are intimately involved with all the persons that could affect the negotiations on your side and on the other side and across the table, then you can be a bit farther than they expect you to be when it comes to negotiating an issue or a topic that they expected you to not being prepared to.
Gotcha.
So preparation, and again, preparation.
Fantastic. So you do have a parallel for karate. I think it was in maybe Getting to Yes, where they talk about it being jiu-jitsu or something like that. So you do have an analogy and an approach based on that. So that's really interesting.
Yeah. Expect the unexpected, but be calm, but be aware at the same time. Very well awakened. Don't get too tired. Those negotiations could be very tiring. Never get too tired.
Anything I haven't asked you about that you wouldn't mind speaking?
Is there anything you did not ask?
I've got more. I could keep going. I'm just, again, sensitive to your time, but how about where can people get the book?
Oh, just get online and just tap Reflections on Conflict Resolution in the Middle East and Beyond by Gilead Sher. And you get the book on Amazon, on other.
I'll put a link up to it. Just to make it easy.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Again, I could keep going, but I'll
we
let
can
you
speak for a day.
I know that you have a wealth of knowledge, and I love hearing about these stories, that extracting the lessons, the theory from the experiences, and thank you so much for speaking with me and sharing. And thanks again.
Thank you, Warren. Anytime.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more from international experts digging into a range of topics on conflict, power, and persuasion, subscribe to your favorite podcast app or visit us at ciian.org. That's CIIAN.org.